Hi everyone, this is Matthew Janda for Card Runners, and I'm here with Cutoff vs. Button vs. Blind Play Part 6, 3-bet pots as the small blind 3-better. So let's first go over the goals for this video. I'm going to do a quick review of the small blind 3-betting range. Then I want to randomly generate a couple flops and make my best guess as to what we do with our range. This makes it easier for me to remember how I'm wrong and shows me how well I'm likely actually playing when time is limited. So most of you probably already know this from my other videos, but right now I'm really big on trying to make a quick guess for how we overall play our range when we see a board texture, because in reality, you don't have half an hour or an hour to write down what you do with every single hand in your range and see if you think you're bluffing too much or too little and see, like what, if you're betting a polarized range, what your ratio of value bets and bluffs are. So I'm really big on now just seeing a board texture and making your best guess quickly, and then afterwards, if you have time and you want to analyze it, seeing how your guess was wrong. Because if you actually do make a guess and you're wrong, you're going to remember it a lot better than if you're just looking at the work someone else has already done, or if you didn't commit to making a guess to begin with, it's going to be easier for you to just miss your own leaks. Then after that, off screen, I'm going to start streaming Curb Your Enthusiasm by Larry David for a few hours and write down what I think I should do with every hand in my range. So luckily, this TV show is incredibly entertaining, so I can put that on the side while I spend several hours writing down every single hand combination, seeing how well things actually look balanced, and then you don't have to watch me do all that. I can afterwards just present the results to you and discuss my findings. So hopefully, I did this video style last video, and I really liked it, although I haven't gotten to see feedback yet at the time of making this one. But I think this should be really beneficial for people that are watching it. And I think me doing a lot of the grunt work off screen just makes your life easier, and it is a more efficient use of your time. So I'm still waiting for feedback, but hopefully you guys are liking this video and you're excited to see one where I'm in the small blind 3-betting against the cutoff. So here is the small blind 3-betting range that I'm using and all of its glory. And if you remember, the small blind 3-betting range is what a lot of people would call a linear 3-betting range. We are only 3-betting or folding when we're in the small blind and facing a cutoff open. So because of that, we've only got the good hands in our range. It's not like the big blind 3-betting range where we can just look at once more right now. It's not like the big blind 3-betting range where it's more polarized. The small blind 3-betting range is a linear range. So because of that, we're going to have a lot of hands that are going to be pretty good but not great post-flop, which might be a little awkward to play if we face a lot of aggression, but it will also make it easier for us to defend our checks because we'll have hands that, are like the right hand strength where they're not strong enough to really bet multiple streets effectively, but they also make pretty good check calls. So I don't think playing this range will be too difficult, but it's also a range that I'm not incredibly comfortable with, which is why we're going to do the whole thing where I make my best guess, then I analyze it off screen for a little bit, and we come back and talk about it. All right, so let's jump in. So before a flop's dealt, the small blind 3-betting range has 53% equity against the cutoff 3-bet calling range. And I did put in all the ace-10 off and king-jack off into the cutoff 3-bet calling range, which I think is fine, won't have a huge effect. So this is how much equity we're starting out with, and we're going to randomly generate our first flop and see how that changes. So the first flop is ace-10-9. Okay, so I'll guess the equity in just a moment, but let's start with just talking about what I do with each hand in my range. So the first thing I'm going to do on this board is notice that I think the 10 and the 9 are the two cards that are sort of best for the cutoff 3-bet calling range. And even though they're not terrible for our small blind 3-betting range, they're not ideal because we didn't make 2-pair with ace-10 off or ace-9 off. And that's really key here, right? Like we 3-bet king-jack off, but not ace-10 off, even though these two hands are really close in strength. I happen to think king-jack off is better, and we just happen to, miss the 2-pair because we don't have ace-10 off or ace-9 off. So I think this flop is actually reasonably bad for the small blind 3-betting range. Even though ace-high flops are usually good for the small blind 3-betting range, I wouldn't be surprised if ace-10-9 is literally the nut-low ace-high flop, because the 10 and the 9 are just good for the cutoff 3-bet caller. Maybe something like ace-10-10 is worse or something like that. But I think it's a reasonably bad ace-high flop, but at the end of the day, it's still ace-high, so it's not terrible. So I would start with check raising on this flop with pocket 10s, pocket 9s. I would check call pocket aces. I would value bet ace jack, ace queen, and ace king. That would pretty much be my value betting range. I would also value bet, I think, pocket jacks and king 10 those are like the value bets that aren't going to bet multiple streets. So my betting range isn't insanely polarized here because I will bet some hands that plan to check call later. So that would be pocket jacks and king 10. I would check call on the flop with queens, kings, any 10x, any 9x. And then I would also check call with the ace 5, ace 4. I'd probably go ahead and value bet, I guess, like ace 9. But ace 9 maybe should be check raised as well. Something like that seems good. We're not going to be betting at a crazy high frequency or a crazy tight frequency. But yeah, that seems reasonable to me here. And I wouldn't be surprised if I find out I'm betting too much here. Because I think we're probably going to have like 49.5% equity on this flop as the 3-better. Let's look. Oops, sorry, got to put in the board texture. All right, so that's ace of diamonds, 10 of hearts, 9 of spades. So yeah, I would stick with the strategy that I pretty much already mentioned, but I wouldn't be surprised if I'm betting a little bit too much here. All right, cool. So it is about 49.5% equity, but we do have a pretty good distribution of equity. But let's just check. So we have top pair, 37.7%. Let's see how the cutoff 3-bet caller has it. A little bit more often, but I'll have weaker top pairs. The small blind 3-better has 2-pair or better 9.4% of the time, whereas the 3-bet caller has 2-pair or better 15.1% of the time. And that makes sense because we just talked about how not making 2-pair with ace 10 off is kind of a big deal. Okay. So this is not usual in the sense that the 3-better is usually going to have more premium hands, right? The premium hands on the flop are usually going to be like overpairs, but overpairs aren't possible here. And the 2-pair combination that is possible is only in the cutoff cold calling range. So because of that, it's odd, but the small blind actually has less premium hands in the cutoff. So it's actually really tough to say who overall has the better distribution of equity. Like, obviously the cutoff has position here, which is advantageous, but I don't know who overall has the better distribution of equity because on one hand, hands like ace king are really good and only the small blind 3-better has them. But on the other hand, the cutoff has the ace 10, which are better than ace king, and both ranges have pocket aces, pocket 9s, pocket 8s. So it's actually really close, and while I thought the small blind 3-better had the better distribution of equity, and it almost always will, on this specific board it might not be true. The small blind 3-better might have a worse distribution of equity. So because of that, we don't want to get too crazy when we bet out of position here. So this is definitely a board I'm really curious to do, and we'll come back to it in just a couple minutes. For what it's worth, I think in reality, where most of my experience has come from is, playing No Limit 200 a couple years ago, I think the strategy I recommended will be really good, where we just bet on the flop with ace king, ace queen, ace jack, the king 10 and the pocket jacks that I talked about. But I also think you can usually get away with assuming the cutoff opponent won't know how good this board texture is for his range, so you're not going to get bluff raised enough. So this is a good example of a spot where if I was a small blind 3-better and I was playing like anonymous No Limit 200 tables on some random site like Bovada, if I c-bet on the flop with ace queen and got raised, I wouldn't feel horrible about folding it because I don't expect my opponents to bluff raise enough. Whereas if you're playing against opponents that are really, really good, then yeah, that's going to be much more of an issue and you could end up getting pushed off some really good hands. Anyways, let's go to the next board texture. So here we go. King, Jack, 8. All right, so let's just plug this in for later. And I'll talk about it before I look at the equity. Okay, so this board is going to be a lot better, I think, for the 3-betting range because we do make the 2-pair, and that's a big deal. So we do have the King, Jack off in our range, and then we also have Ace, King. So once again, similar to the last board, what I'm also just starting to notice is because we're 3-betting with this linear range preflop and we're getting called, we aren't, I think, that much ahead on a lot of board textures. Like, we definitely overall have the better range, but we're out of position and we aren't that much ahead, which is further driving the point home, which is you need to get very comfortable check calling in 3-bet pots even as the 3-better and check raising and all that fun stuff. Okay, so on this board, I would value bet, I think, on the flop with King, Queen, Ace, King. Pretty much King, Queen, and better I'm going to value bet, with the exception that I'll usually just go for a check raise with, again, 8s and jacks, and I'll probably check call pocket kings. So King, Queen, and better I'm value betting. I'll also bet queens for like one street the same way as before, and I'll bet ace, jack. So one thing you'll see me often do now when I talk in videos is, like, I might want to bet some jack X hands. So you'll see me bet like the ace, jack hand, but I'll check call like the jack 10 hand, because let's say our opponent has queen, jack on the flop. I expect our opponent to usually check back queen jack if he has queen jack on the flop and we check. So if we have ace jack, it's nice if we bet because we got extra value from our opponent's queen jack. Whereas if we have jack 10, we don't want to bet because if we bet there, then we just cost ourselves, money because our opponent calls with a better hand. So you'll see me very often bet with like the middle pair that has the best possible kicker because I'm usually getting, value from my opponent's middle pair hands, where I won't often bet the middle pair with the bad or mediocre kickers. There's always exceptions, and in reality, I'm not really good enough to tell how useful denying the opponent's equity is on a lot of board textures. So like, for example, one argument I might give here for why betting ace-jack would be good is, hey, it can deny my opponent some equity. But I don't know how many queen X hands we really make the opponent fold. Like, for example, if we bet ace-jack and our opponent folds a random queen, yeah, we denied him the equity of, turning a queen. But I don't know if we even make him fold any queens on the flop. So let's just look. Queen 9 doesn't fold, queen 10 doesn't fold, queen jack doesn't fold, king queen doesn't fold, ace queen doesn't fold. So like that would be a good example where I'm just not that, even though I'm usually using that bet sizing range that I talked about, where I'll bet the middle pair with the best kicker, because like if the board was, king 7-3 and you bet ace 7 in a totally different situation, anytime you make your opponent fold like, 9-10 or 10 jack or something like that, you'll be denying a reasonable amount of equity, as well as if you bet, ace 7 on the king 7-3 board, you might get a lot of value from your opponent's weaker sevens in like a button versus big blind spot. But unfortunately, I'm not good enough to tell really, really quickly with like the high cards if we're actually making our opponent fold that many hands that have that much equity. So, when we bet ace-jack, I'm doing it mostly to get value from my opponent's weaker jacks and have some jacks in my range on the turn. I would like it if I'm denying my opponent the ability to realize his equity with some hands, but realistically, if we look here, it looks like we're not. Most of the hands that have a reasonable chance to outdraw us are going to go ahead and call when we bet the flop, even with ace-jack. Okay, so yeah, I would bet ace-jack. I think we might find that it's better to just bet king 10 suited and king 9 suited and check the ace-jack. And I'll talk about that more after I read out all the hand combos. But that would be because, like, I'm going to go to this board just to illustrate what I'm saying. If this was the flop, king 7-3, then a hand like, king 9 or king 10 might make a really good check call because they're not that vulnerable. Whereas a hand like pocket 8s might make a really good bet because it can get value from 7s and it's vulnerable. So you'll often see me like, or a better example would be like ace 7 here, as I already kind of talked about. I might bet with ace 7 here, but check call with king 2 here if we were in like a button versus big blind situation. Because my argument would be, hey, with king 2, I'm not really afraid of giving a free card, so I'll check call it. Whereas with ace 7, I can get value, and it's more important to deny my opponent the ability to realize his equity with his like queen 9s or, jack 10s and stuff like that. So that's why you see me often bet ace 7 and check call king 2. And again, I think that works pretty well. But when we have the board texture right here in the 3-bet pot, that line of thinking might not be all that useful because at the end of the day, we might not, when we bet ace-jack on the flop, we might not really deny him his equity really that effectively. He might not fold any high equity hands. And if we're going to bet some like good but not great hands that can only bet one or two streets, it might just be better to bet with like king 9 of spades, so the opponent has 3 jacks in his range and we beat all of them, including ace-jack, rather than bet with like ace-jack, which when we bet that, there'll only be 2 jacks in his range. So yeah, if we bet king 9, our opponent has 2 kings and 3 jacks, whereas if we bet ace-jack, our opponent has 3 kings and 2 jacks. I know I'm going over this stuff really fast, and maybe this isn't the right point to talk about it, but this is how I would have approached the flop right here, and I'm trying to tell you what I would have done in practice, whereas I think when I write out all the combos, I'm going to see it probably would have been better for me to just bet with king 10 and king 9 and check all the jacks. And not having a jack in our range on the turn probably isn't that huge a deal. Okay, so yeah, a lot of that kind of stuff. And I think we're going to see some mixed strats with stuff like ace-queen. Maybe we can check call it or bet it. We're mostly just going to check call all of our jacks. I think that's pretty obvious. I think even a hand like pocket 10s will be check called here. Pocket 9s, my guess is, would be check folded, but I'm not positive. Whereas the 8s might make a good... We talked about this in the last video. We maybe could check raise some 8x hands. So like maybe if we had 8-9 of spades, we could check raise it. We can't really have any backdoor flush draws with the 8x, which is kind of unfortunate. But yeah, we'll be check raising some hands like that to balance out our pocket jacks and pocket 8s. So I will talk... Hopefully this wasn't too rambly. I'll write out all the combos and we'll talk about it more in a couple minutes. And the last thing I'll do is guess equity. I'm guessing the 3-betting range has something like 52% equity here. Okay, cool. Even more than that, 53. Awesome. All right, so let's randomly generate one more board texture at least, maybe two more. Oh, 975. That's a fun one. Okay, so these are the hardest boards to do when you're trying to write out your whole range. Overall, I think a board texture like this favors the 3-betting range quite a bit, but I could be wrong. That might be more the case when we have like the big blind 3-betting range. Like, look at this bad boy right now. The big blind 3-betting range kind of has like overpairs, overcards with a lot of equity, like ace king and ace queen, and then a lot of suited connector and suited gapper stuff, which just nails the 975 board. So it's very possible that this board texture is like phenomenal for the big blind 3-better, but might not be quite as good for the small blind 3-better. That said, I still think it's decently good, and I'll of course analyze it more in just a minute. But I think this small blind 3-better has a much better distribution of equity than the cutoff 3-bet cold caller. Let's look. I think that's definitely going to be true, though I could be wrong. Both ranges have sets, but it's like 4.2% for the cutoff 3-bet caller, whereas the small blind 3-better has 3.3% sets. They both have the exact same set combos. So, I mean, sets are going to be phenomenal, but they're just rare. And the big blind 3-better has 30 combos of overpairs, whereas the cutoff 3-bet caller only has 12 combos of overpairs, right? So I think the small blind is going to be doing pretty good here. What I usually do on a spot like this is c-bet my whole range. Maybe check folding something like king jack off or queen king off or ace jack off if I don't think my opponent folds enough, which isn't a balanced strategy, but it's still, like, you can imagine if you just bet on this flop 80% of the time and then just check fold your 20% weakest hands. That would be a strategy that's pretty easy to implement, even though it's clearly not optimal. It's a pretty reasonably easy strategy to implement that will still work pretty well. That said, we definitely want to do better than that when we're writing out all the hand combos. So my guess is my guess would be you bet this flop at a very high frequency and you have some sort of small check defending range. So what I would do in practice, realistically, if I was playing at anonymous tables, I'm guessing I would check fold king jack off, ace jack off, and anything else that like just completely whiffs, like ace 10 of clubs, king 10 of clubs, and queen 10 of clubs. Those would be like the hands I check fold, and then I would probably bet almost everything else because the other hands are like pretty good, or like they're either really good, like they're already there, like sets or top pair good kicker, or overpairs, or they just have a lot of equity, like ace queen or ace king. That said, I know that's not optimal. It's just a reasonably easy strategy to implement, whereas the optimal strategy is going to involve like some check calling, some check raising, and be trickier. The last thing I'll mention would be this, which is like, let's imagine I write out all the hand combos and think we should be betting on this flop 78% and checking 22%. If we check 22% and check call, maybe a little more than half the time, in order to make that check calling range feel balanced, like, it's hard for our opponent to know what we have. We're not completely transparent. It's probably going to require like a lot of mixed strategies. So it's possible like ace king off or ace queen off should go in both the betting and the check calling range on the flop. And that stuff's very tricky. So, it's hard for me to talk about this, but I would think in theory, we are check calling like some of the mediocre pairs, like maybe pocket eights, some of the random nines. We're check calling with some of like the good overcards. I don't know if we would slow play anything on this flop, but maybe we could slow play like pocket aces or pocket nines. And then because it's hard for us to check call on this flop, we would probably emphasize check raising a little bit more, and our opponent, when he bets, might bet a little bit smaller. But yeah, that's something we'll talk about later, but this is going to be a hard board to do. All right, so I'm going to pause for a couple hours and work out these boards. Then I'm going to come back and we're going to talk about what I found. Okay, so I just went through and did the 3 board textures, and these were actually quite a bit harder than the ones from the last video. So there's a little bit more to talk about. They took a little bit longer to do. Okay, so let's jump into the first board texture, which was the ace of diamonds, 10 of hearts, 9 of spades. So I'll put that in right here. Ace of diamonds, 10 of hearts, 9 of spades, and we'll get to talking. So both the first and the second board texture illustrated that leak that I was worried that maybe I had when I was talking about my initial impression a couple minutes ago. And that is, I think I'm emphasizing a little bit too much betting middle pairs with the good kicker. And I'm used to that from having played heads up in the last year. I haven't played that much, but when I did play, I was playing heads up and having fun with it. And if the board's like king 7-3 and I'm on the button for heads up, I'm very often going to bet my sevens with the good kicker. And I'm still doing that for the little bit of 6 max I'm playing, but I don't think it's working as well in 3-bet pots. And it is going to be showcased in both the first and the second board texture. All right, so let's look at the first board texture. I originally wanted to bet pocket jacks and then bet them on the flop and then check call them on the turn. But the problem with that, and it's still not bad to bet that, but the reason why that's not working as well as I'd like is when we bet pocket jacks, I'm going to mark them as the dead cards, I don't think there's a single king or queen we're making fold in this button 3-bet, this cutoff call versus 3-bet range. Because the 3-bet calling range is pretty strong, and any time our opponent has a king or a queen, they're going to have either a pair or some sort of draw with it. So I don't think we're usually going to make the opponent fold any hands that have a lot of equity against us, so that makes me less into betting jacks. Now, I could be wrong, but my original argument for checking with a hand like, let me click ace-5 of clubs, and betting with a hand like pocket jacks was, I'm going to bet pocket jacks because both ace-5 and pocket jacks can't really bet in multiple streets, so I'm going to bet the one that's a little bit more vulnerable, which is the pocket jacks, and check with the hand that's a little bit stronger, which is the ace-5. That I think will usually work, but I think in these specific spots, now I'm just thinking, you know what? Betting jacks doesn't really make the opponent fold any hands that have that much equity against me, so I'm not even really in love with betting pocket jacks here. In this specific board texture, the ace-10-9, since our range isn't that great compared to the opponents, usually we expect the 3-betting range to be quite a bit stronger, but that's not the case here. I ended up betting with ace-king and ace-queen and ace-9 suited, ace-9 suited being the 2 pair. These are my strong bets where if I bet the flop and the turn and the river both blank, I think we're going to bet all 3 streets. I put ace-jack as a mediocre bet, meaning I don't think ace-jack's usually going to be strong enough to go bet. I think if we were to work out the math for that, we'd see that if we get it all in by the river, the next strongest hand that ace-jack beats is ace-8. I don't think the opponent will need to call down with that. So I think, and even if he does call down with it, it still might not be best to go bet. So I put ace-jack as a mediocre bet, meaning we're going to bet it on the flop and probably check call it later. And then the weak bets are just the bluffs, the gut shots, king, queen, king, jack, 7-6 suited. That stuff should be pretty simple, as well as the draws. So this is the betting range, and I'm betting a little bit less than half the time. Usually I'll bet more than half the time in a 3-bet pot, but here I don't think our range is that much stronger than the opponent's that we can bet at that high of a frequency. Okay. So now I want to talk a little bit more about why I would rather bet on the flop with ace-jack or ace-5 or ace-4 than pocket jacks. I already mostly mentioned it, which is I don't think pocket jacks really make any high equity hands fold. But the other thing too is if I have pocket jacks, there's 3 aces in the opponent's range, whereas if I have an ace, there's only 2. If I have ace-jack, I want to bet now to make sure I get value from, what did the cutoff call a 3-bet with? From the cutoffs like ace-8 or ace-5, or if he had pocket jacks, and I know I've tweaked these ranges a bit since then, but I think he probably would mostly call a 3-bet with pocket jacks. So if my opponent has pocket jacks, ace-8 or ace-5, it's good if we bet ace-jack and our opponent calls. Whereas if we have pocket jacks, it's bad if we bet them and our opponent calls, because if we would have checked jacks on the flop, I think our opponent would have likely checked back if he had the ace-8 or the ace-5. So I think, we're not really denying that much equity realization if we bet pocket jacks rather than ace-jack, whereas ace-jack can get a little bit more value. So that's the hand I'd rather bet now. Likewise, if I didn't want to bet ace-jack, if I wanted to check with that, I would just bet the ace-5 or the ace-4 instead before I would bet pocket jacks, because, again, pocket jacks just don't really make that many hands that can outdraw us fold. I'll just say it one more time. I'm sorry if I'm getting repetitive, but if the board texture were different and this was the flop, ace-10-4 was the flop, and let's say we were in a different situation, blind versus blind, then maybe betting pocket jacks could be fantastic, because we might make the opponent fold some random king X's or some random queen X's, and we might be getting a lot more value from our opponent's 10x hands. So jacks can totally be fine to bet. I mean, there are easily situations where we can imagine betting pocket jacks on an ace-high board and check calling with ace-2 or ace-3. I just think in a 3-bet pot, this one right here, I don't think is it. Okay, so that should be pretty straightforward with the betting range now that we got rid of the tricky parts. The checking range, I think, is also reasonably straightforward. My guess is this is supposed to be pocket 9s. Yeah, it is. Okay, so I'm check raising pocket 10s and pocket 9s, and we want to emphasize check raising more as our opponent's range gets stronger. So that's why you also see me check raising all the sets here rather than just betting them all. So I'm check raising 6 combos of sets. I'm check raising the ace 10, and then I'm check raising 7 bluff combos to go along with it. I've started talking about it already in other videos, but after playing around with Poker Snowy a bit, I think one thing that I've really taken from that program is that program likes to bluff a lot of times with like high equity hands. So a hand like 9-8 of hearts, yeah, that probably makes a fine c-bet hand, but it also has a little bit of showdown value, even though we're probably not going to get to realize it very efficiently. I would rather check raise 9-8 of hearts, because it's going to double barrel very well if our check raise gets called, and we can put a lot of pressure on the opponent's hand. And if we're check raising, we're making the pot very big, which makes me, like having a pretty strong hand that can get there sometimes in my bluffing range. So that's why you see me check raising with 9-8, Jack 9, Queen 9. The other thing is I don't really love check calling with these hands, and if we bet with them, we of course don't get to utilize our showdown value at all. Though to be honest, it's very unlikely, the flop, turn, and river are really going to check through and we're going to win with a random 9. But you see me check raising these hands because they have a lot of equity, especially a hand like Jack 9 of diamonds. It's just going to turn good hands pretty often or turn really good semi-bluffing hands. So I'm check raising decently aggressively because I think this board connects with the opponent very well. So when we check, he should bet pretty often. And as you know from other videos, if we did check and our opponent checks back, now we have a lot of strong hands where we can start betting on the turn and we're allowed to bet big. So you don't always have to do it, but at least consider if you checked with ace 10, planning to check raise, if your opponent checks back and that turns a 4 of spades, maybe you want to start putting a lot of pressure on him with a big bet. Because if you check out of position from the small blind on this flop, you could have checked some really strong hands planning to check raise. But if your opponent checks back in position, that's probably less likely to be the case because he's giving you a free card with all these hands right here, as well as some hands that you're check folding that aren't listed. Okay, so yeah, we're check raising 15 combos, we're check calling 40. So we're still mostly check calling when we defend our checks, so our opponent's definitely going to want to bet, reasonably often. And you see me check calling with all the kings to jacks. So obviously when we check these hands, we're hoping our opponent checks back. But if he does bet, we're getting a very good price and we're going to call. I think I originally thought we might bet king 10 suited. Again, from that leak that I think I had, which is trying to bet middle pair top kicker too often. But here, I don't think we need to bet it because we're just not making hands we're vulnerable against fold. So yeah, you see me check calling with kings to jacks, king 10 suited. Still check calling with ace 5, ace 4, mainly because we just can't bet too aggressively here. I don't think our range is better than our opponents, or if it is better, it's not by enough for us to bet that aggressively. Then I'm check calling with the better, with the pairs of 10s, queen 10, jack 10. And then I even check called with the king 9 suited too. Slow played pocket aces by check calling. Okay, so let me see what I wrote here when I was taking notes. So what hands are best to bet flop and check call later? Probably bet like ace 5. So I actually changed that later to ace jack. So probably bet ace jack because betting jacks doesn't make them fold and need king x or queen x anyways. Okay, and then note our flop check calling range is almost all bluff catchers, but we are check raising the flop aggressively, which makes it hard for our opponent to exploit us by betting one street with the intention to always check back on the turn. So let's talk about that a bit. So I will be the first person to admit that this flop check calling range is very vulnerable to multiple barrels, especially if our opponent has an ace in his hand. Because even though we are slow playing pocket aces, and that makes up a little less than 10% of our check calling range, if our opponent has an ace, there's a huge removal effect for that. The other aces we have are ace 5 and ace 4 suited. So we don't really have that many strong hands that are check calling the flop. In fact, we pretty much have none other than pocket aces. And all these hands that I'm highlighting are basically bluff catchers that can, of course, improve on the right turn. I like it when I can check call with a hand that can bluff later, but here we don't really have that many good hands to float with, and I decided to bet with the hands that can get there, like king queen or king jack. So this check calling range is definitely pretty vulnerable once our opponent knows this is what our range consists of, but keep in mind that this flop check raising range right here makes it difficult for our opponent to recklessly bet on the flop. So if we're checking 79 combos and we're check raising 15, that means we're going to be check raising on this flop 20% of the time. So let's imagine our opponent does have ace 8 on the flop. Even though our opponent would want to for sure bet ace 8 if he knew we were going to check call, the reason that's going to make him reluctant to bet ace 8 is not because he can't crush our check calling range. It's because it's so bad when he faces a check raise. This check raising range is reasonably balanced. It's got a little more value than, it's got a little more than a 1-to-1 value to bluff. So 8 value combos and 7 pretty good check raise bluff combos. So we're check raising aggressively, and it makes it hard for our opponent to really try to exploit this weak check calling range because, yeah, he's in good shape once we check call, but we are check raising pretty often, and that makes it hard for him to bet aggressively against this check calling range because he doesn't know, once we check, he doesn't know whether or not we're going to check call or check raise. It will suck once we've check called and if we get something like a blank turn, but like let's say we got the 4, which is a blank turn, we still have ace 4 suited, we still have pocket aces, and then we are just going to end up having to call with a lot of bluff catching hands, even if we're not happy about it. So like, let's say the turn's the 4, we're going to have pocket aces, we're going to have ace 4 suited, but we're not going to be able to fold ace 5, we're not going to be able to fold kings, and I doubt we're going to be able to fold queens. So we are going to have to do that whole, hey, we have a marginal made hand out of position and we need a bluff catch thing, and no one likes doing that, but unfortunately that's just how like theoretical poker gets played. It sucks to have marginal hands out of position that have, very non-robust equity, but you just can't really get away from it, and sometimes you're going to end up folding those hands when they were the best hand, other times you're going to end up calling with those hands when they were the worst hand. Not much we can do. And then if we did check call, like let's say the turn came before and it went check and the river came like, a jack. If we start having some pretty good hands in our range that want to start value betting, like if we want to bet some 2 pairs or the pocket aces, we'll just have to turn a hand like king 9 suited into a bluff. Okay, so that is the first board texture. Hopefully everything's pretty clear there. So let's look at the next board texture, which is the king of clubs, jack of clubs, 8 of hearts. And already I was noticing the same thing that I just learned in the last board texture, so I didn't make the same mistake again. But here, my gut reaction is to want to, where were you? Where are you? My gut reaction is to want to bet ace jack, as I already talked about, because I like having, I have some, jacks in my betting range, and then, I can get value from my opponent's weaker jacks and maybe make them fold some high equity hands. So that's why I like betting the middle pair top kicker. I'm beating a dead horse at this point. But in reality, as we can already see, cutoffers 3-bet flat. Ace jack really isn't making them fold. When we bet ace jack, we're not making them fold any hands that ace jack is vulnerable against. So I think it's now just check it. And then if we want some hands that can bet the flop and check call later, I think king 10 and king 9 fit that bill quite a bit better, actually. So, hopefully that was a somewhat big improvement by me, going through this stuff and hopefully learning it a little better. Queens, I think we also can bet. Queens beat 3 combos of jack, there's 3 jacks in the deck when we have queens and 3 kings. Whereas if we have a king ourselves, then there's only 2 kings in the deck and then 3 jacks. So these are all, I think, pretty reasonable mediocre bets to give us 12 combos that can check call later. Then our strong bets on this board, which I think are pretty straightforward, are king jack, ace king, king queen. As I'm talking, I now realize I miss pocket aces, which happens. So I would throw aces in this as well, and then that would maybe allow us to bluff a few more hand combos. Honestly, I've spent a long time on these. I'm not going to go back and tweak everything for pocket aces. So everything should be pretty straightforward there. And the other thing you want to keep in mind is, one thing that's kind of frustrating about these ranges is, let's say we add in those 6 pocket ace combos. We might have trouble finding more bluffs. Because if you look at these bluffs, I already said let's bet the 9s with a club and 3 combos of 10s. And then I said let's call the other 3 combos of 10s. It's tricky to find bluffs in spots like this. Because there's just a huge, I talked about it a lot last video, there's a huge jump in bluff quality when we go from like whether or not we have a gut shot to just complete nothing. So like an example of a complete nothing hand would be like ace 5 of spades. Yeah, we can use that as a bluff. Where are you? Yeah, we can use that hand as a bluff, but ace 5 of spades, 8 4 of spades, they're probably not good enough. Likewise, a hand like 6 5 of diamonds, something like that, 7 6 of diamonds. These hands just don't seem good enough to bluff with. So one thing that makes these ranges kind of tricky when you're trying to like somewhat balance them is you just might not have access to as many bluffs as you want, which I think happens less often in raised pots. So here, you could get really, really technical with tons of mixed strategies, but at the end of the day, we're just guessing, and we're trying to make a strategy that's reasonable to implement. So here, I wish I had some more ace-queen or ace-10 type hands that I could just bluff with on the flop, especially if I add aces to the betting range, but I'm already bluffing with hands like 9s or 10s that I think kind of suck as bluffs, that it's going to get harder to find. It's going to get harder to really widen this bluffing range. I just put FD for the flush draws because I didn't want to write them all out. But yeah, we're betting 16 draw combos here. We have 45 total value bets with 33 of them being strong, which can probably bet multiple streets, if not all three streets. And then the queens and the king 10 and the king 9, I'm planning on mostly check calling the turn. Yeah. All right. So the betting range I think is pretty straightforward. So our betting frequency should be a little bit higher once we add in aces. And I do apologize for missing them. It's just realistically, it's very time consuming to try to add that stuff in all at the end. The checking range, I think, is very straightforward. So we're check raising the middle and the bottom set, as I often do. Cool. Here are the 5 check raise bluff combos. One's even a flush draw because we have flush draws here. Okay. And then you'll see me again. I'm trying to check raise the bottom pair, like the 9-8 and the 8-7. And I wish I had like 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight stuff that I could check raise. I just don't really have them on this board texture. So another good example of a spot where I think it would be hard to bluff unless you're really thinking, because you don't have that like really obvious check raise bluffs. Whereas in some other spots where you have 3 to a flush, 3 to a straight more often, it's easier to both, it's just easier to have bluffing hands. Check calls, pocket kings because removal effect. I can even see not check calling kings though, since there's so much coordination on this board. And then ace jack is a check calls I talked about, queen jack, jack 10, so just the bluff catching, medium strength stuff that can improve. Same with jack 9, check calling 2 flush draws that can be bluffed later, and I'm also check calling 10s. Not thrilled about it. And now that I know we have aces somewhere, maybe we should just be betting all the 10s and then bet the aces too. That could be very reasonable. Tough to say. But I did check call the 10s because that equity is not very robust. And against the opponent's flopping range, 10s did have about 50% equity. I was quite unsure what to do with 10s, which is why you see it split. And I don't even say where the club goes. And 9s were very tricky as well. So yeah, this was a pretty hard board to do because as I keep mentioning, we have a lot of like strong hands, but we don't really have hands that make, we don't really have as many hands that make good bluffs as we'd like, which makes it hard to get the sort of ratio that I usually look for, but that just tends to happen in 3-bet pots, so you do the best you can. Let's now look at the last board, which is the 9 of diamonds, the 7 of hearts, and the 5 of spades. And you'll notice I put all 188 combos in the betting range. And I didn't do this because I think it's optimal, but if you remember in other videos I've shown how when we are in a spot where our range looks a lot weaker than our opponents, I start with saying, hey, let's check everything and see if we can defend enough of our checks. If we can't, then we really shouldn't have a donk betting range or a betting range if we're out of position, even if we're the pre-flop raiser. Because even if we check all our good hands, our checking range still isn't strong enough. Here I decided to do the opposite, where I tried at first to sort of balance the range the same way I usually do, but it doesn't work very well here because it's very hard to define like a strong bet or a mediocre bet or even a weak bet here. Like, for example, ace-king I put as a mediocre bet because the cutoff only has ace-king beat about a third of the time. But I put ace-queen as a weak bet even though I put ace-king as a mediocre bet. And there's no right or wrong. Like, this is a linear 3-betting range, so that means we have hands that are, not clear value bets or not clear bluffs, right? It's not a polarized range. So everything's very tricky here. But I started out putting everything in the betting range to just get a sense of like, okay, if we were to bet our entire range on this flop, would our range be too weak and by how much? Well, there's of course no way to just solve directly for if this range is too strong or too weak, but as is talked about in the 2+2 book and in some other theory videos in card winners, in a 3-bet pot, if you were betting like a perfectly polarized range, you probably want around 3 bluffs for every 2 value bets. Here we're out of position, and position matters because we don't have a perfectly polarized range. And of course, there's other assumptions that go into the model that don't work in practice. But that's like a good rough estimate for starting. So right off the bat, I can see that I have only 51 strong bets. And even then, it's pretty arbitrarily chosen when I decide to call a hand a strong bet here. I said 10-9 or better is a strong bet, and 10-9 is not really even better than 9-8. It's all very tricky. But we have too many bluffs for how many strong bets that I have. So that's telling me like, we're not that far off, but we're probably bluffing a little bit too much if we bet our entire range on this flop. So now what I could do is start slowly bluffing less hands and start check folding with them. Like, let's say, for example, I'm just going to cut and paste this. I'm going to check fold my non-suited king, jack, and queen, king. So that's 6 combos of the suited king, queen that are going to bet. Then I'm going to like check fold 26, the king, queen off, and the king, jack off. Well, now if I'm checking 26 combos to check fold, so we have 26 less combos that are bet. I'm going to put this right here. Just going to fix everything real quick. So if I'm betting 26 less combos, I've just strengthened my betting range by a lot, right? Because I just took off like more than a quarter of my bluffs. But now if I'm check folding my king jack off and my king queen off, there's clearly a counter strategy for my opponent, which is whenever I check, my opponent should always bet because he always denies me his equity, right? Imagine I'm just checking those hands and I'm never defending them. So there's a counter strategy there. So then the next step would be to go, So now if my opponent knows I'm always check folding once I check, I should probably start defending some of my checks. Because if he knew I was always check folding once I checked, he'd always bet. And then a check raise would be very effective. So now I can start pulling out some hands out of my, strong betting range to check raise. And I can also start pulling out some hands out of my mediocre betting range to check call with. So maybe I start check calling with some ace king. Maybe I start check calling with some pocket eights. Maybe I start check raising some, pocket aces on the flop, and then I start check raising some air. I can make a balanced checking range, but I think this range would be quite hard to implement. And again, if I were to play right now, I'm going to play no limit 200 anonymous tables on Bovada. I for sure would not try to implement this strategy, even if I spent the next hour really tweaking and making this range. I would just say, you know what, at the end of the day, I think the easiest thing to do is just say, I'm just going to, I'm bluffing a little bit too much here. And in reality, I think the king, queen off and the king, jack off especially just aren't good enough. So I would just start check folding, my weakest air hands. So I had a king 10 suited 4. Let's make that 3. Let's only barrel the ones that have the backdoor flush draw. Queen, jack suited again. Let's make that 3. I would just basically, I'm saying the way I think it's best for the vast majority of players watching this video, the thing I think it's best for you to do is just try to implement a more reasonable, easier strategy. And for me here, that's just to check fold some garbage hands so this betting range is really strong and not worry, if I'm betting 85% of the time on the flop, or if I'm betting 80% of the time on the flop, and then once I check, I'm always check folding, I don't have a huge problem with that. Yes, it's clearly not optimal, but what is optimal would probably be a lot more difficult to implement to not win that much more money, even if you're implementing it well. The optimal strategy would be good if you were playing against like a nemesis type opponent, but if my opponent doesn't know my range and he doesn't know that I'm always check folding, sometimes even if I'm always check folding once I check on this flop, in reality, sometimes my opponents are just going to check back and I'm going to get free cards with king, queen, or ace, jack, or whatever else I'm checking with. So, yeah, this is a spot where I think I would just take the easier strategy. And the other thing too, I could really spend the next hour or whatever tweaking this range a lot if I wanted. And I honestly did try to just jump in the way I usually do on this board texture, and I just wasn't getting things to work out. I think it would require tons of mixed strategies, which I'm not good enough to implement, especially when I think it's going to not really help me all that much. And so I would ask you as you're watching this, what kind of hands do you want to check a call with? Because clearly if we're going to try to make an optimal range after we check, we're going to have to check a call with some hands. Because if we never check call, if we always check raised or check folded, then our opponent would just start betting really, really small. So we have to check call some hands. Look at these mediocre bets. Which of these hands do you want to check a call? I'm guessing almost everyone watching this video feels a lot more comfortable just betting ace-king on the flop than they do check calling it. Just betting 9-8 on the flop or 8 on the flop or 8-7 on the flop than they do check calling with it. I personally do, and I also don't love letting my opponent realize his equity, which is going to happen when we check with the intention to check a call. He always gets to realize the equity with all the hands in his range. So yeah, I know these are theory videos, and I'm sorry if this is kind of lame, but this I think is just a really good board texture of a spot where yeah, we know we're not doing the optimal strategy, but the optimal strategy would have tons of mixed strats in it, and I think it's not reasonable for the vast majority of us to spend time working on it or really trying to implement it. Because if I did, last time I'll say it, I know I'm being kind of repetitive this video, if I did write down the ranges here, it would just be super, super, super mixed. So in order for us to need to use the mixed strategy, we'd have to be playing against a nemesis opponent that would exploit us if we don't. So the best way to phrase that might be is if I was playing against an optimal playing robot, I would totally implement the strategy I just told you, and I would think, it's probably not that much worse than the optimal strategy. Whereas if I was playing against a nemesis opponent that would exploit me, he knew exactly what I do with my whole range, yeah, then I would get crushed by doing this because now, maybe in theory, it's a mixed strategy between betting ace-king and check calling ace-king. But the nemesis opponent will exploit me if I never check call it, whereas an optimal opponent won't. So that's, I think, the last way I would say it, which is even the strategy that I would recommend here, I think it would be what I would try to implement against an optimal opponent. Only a nemesis opponent, I think, would just really rip you apart if you just check folded the worst 40 combos out of, the 180 combos in your range. The good news is I think we do have time to do one more board texture. So let's randomly generate one and try to apply the stuff we've already talked about. All right, so random, boom. All right, 779. So this unfortunately isn't a board where I can really apply what I've kind of learned, which is, we don't need to emphasize betting the middle pair top kicker as much as I like to in, other spots, or especially like heads up spots. So can't really implement that here. 977 is going to be a board where I think it's going to be very, very similar to this one. So I guess we could implement what I just talked about, but it would be very, very similar to this one, where if we bet our whole range on the flop, we might find out that we're betting maybe a little bit too much, but for the most part, I think we should be betting very aggressively on this board. The cutoff 3-bet calling range does not call with almost any sevens. Let's actually look at the exact number. Calls with 6 combos of 7x, and then we have all the really good overpairs for the most part. So I think this board texture would be just very similar to this one, only even better for our range. So again, probably not that interesting of a board texture to do. If I were playing, in practice, I would just bet probably 100% of my range here. All right, so let's randomly generate, 100% of this range, the small blind 3-betting range. So let's randomly generate a new one, 832. So I'm running pretty bad with randomly generated boards today, and I try to give you guys a, unbiased view of all the different board textures we can have. I try not to delete them if I can avoid it. So again, 832, it's going to be the same deal as this. 832, I think, is fantastic for our 3-betting range. So I would see bet 100% of the time here, but, and just know that we're not going to have a clear value betting, medium strength, and weak betting range here. We don't have a polarized range when we bet on this board, but I think we can bet our entire range here because our range is so much better than the opponent's. Okay, random, 984. Okay, so this one is one I'll go ahead and try to balance. It's going to be one where we can already tell that our opponent's going to be doing, I think, reasonably well here. And the reason for that is there's a decent amount of 9s in the opponent's range, a fair amount of 8s, definitely more 8s than there are like 7s. The opponent can have pocket 9s, pocket 8s, pocket 10s, pocket aces, and then a lot of hands that can float, and then positions quite valuable on a board texture like this. So I don't think this board is nearly as bad as like the 10-9-4, but I think it's still a board where the opponent's going to be doing reasonably well. So let's go ahead and plug it into Equilab. My guess is the 3-betting range here has something like... Let's look at the actual 3-betting range. My guess is the 3-betting range has probably about like 51.5 or 52% equity. I could be way off here. Nope, it's around there. And I think if we were to make it, if we were to raise every card by 1, if we make this board 10-9-5, I think the equity is going to just shoot down by quite a bit. But I could be wrong there too. I would imagine this lowers it to 48% equity, a lot. Well, not as much as I thought, but a good amount. Okay, so we might be doing better out of position on this board than I thought, but I'll go ahead. Oh, well, I want to talk about what I would do first. All right, so we're out of position. On this board, I like check raising here a little bit more than I do on some other boards. I think you're going to face a bet a little more often, and we want to protect our checks. So if I was looking to check call on this board, I would probably actually check call with aces with the heart, because I think that's the least vulnerable hand that can check a call, right? Aces with the heart. So if I'm going to slow play here, I'll probably slow play aces with the heart, even before I would slow play pocket 9s, although we might slow play both. And then check raising on the flop. Sure, let's check raise pocket 8s, why not? Or we could check raise something like pocket kings. Again, I don't think it's a big deal here, and I don't know how important the removal effect is. For the most part, I'm just going to bet 10s, jacks, queens, kings. And if I was going to check a call on this flop, other than the really strong hands I already listed, I would probably just check call with my 8x hands, like ace 8, 8-7. I like check calling with some ace queen stuff here. Because ace-king, I think I would rather bet, because we can bet ace-king on the flop, and our opponent will call with ace-queen, and we might still get to showdown. Whereas ace-queen, we can't really do that, right? If we bet ace-queen, we're not really getting as much value from high cards. So I think ace-queen could probably get check-called on this flop. There's going to be some mixed strats, but yeah, I'll go ahead and write everything down. But for the most part, I think we're going to be c-betting here at a reasonably high frequency, probably a little higher than I even initially thought. And then our check calling range is going to be probably a lot of hands will be part of a mixed strategy, but we're check calling with some 9s, most of our 8s, and then some overcard stuff and the really good stuff like aces. And then we'll also check raise here a reasonable percentage. Okay, cool. So I'll go bang it out. All right, I wrote out all the combos. And once again, it's quite difficult to classify hands since we are using a linear 3-betting range. We don't have clear strong bets, mediocre bets, weak bets. So I want to talk specifically to start with about ace-king and ace-queen. So ace-king I put as a weak bet, but ace-king is a hand here that I could easily see betting on the flop Then we check the turn, like on a deuce of spade turn, we check the turn hoping the opponent checks back so we can maybe win at showdown. Then if he does bet, we end up check calling. So it's very hard to classify ace king because we might even end up check calling it on the turn on some specific turns. And ace king has, for the most part, 6 outs on the flop, sometimes 7 outs if it has the runner flush draw. So even though I classified ace king as a weak bet, it's a very strong weak bet. Whenever I put 7 combos, it just means it has the backdoor flush draw. And then the mediocre bets I have as pretty much all my pairs of 9s, other than the ace 9, and then my strong bets are kings to 10s, ace 9, and 9-8 suited. So I think the betting range should be pretty straightforward because all the hands we're betting, other than ace king, have pretty robust equity. So king queen, for example, if I put king queen 7, it means it's the one that can make runner flush draws. So that component is robust equity. Obviously, we're sometimes going to turn a pair with like ace jack or king queen, and it's not going to be robust. So the problem also here is it's very hard to develop a check calling range. And I put all 16 ace queen in the check calling range, though I would imagine that's probably a little bit too much. We probably don't want to call with literally all of our ace queen. So maybe we should make this like a 10 or something like that. Maybe we can call with some of the offsuit combos, but we need to bet some or fold some. So ace queen's probably a mixed strategy, I would think, between betting and check calling and maybe even check folding. But the problem I have with check folding is if we look at the button 3-bet or the cutoff 3-bet flatting range, ace queen there's only 35% weak pair in the cutoff 3-bet flatting range. So it's very hard to justify check folding ace queen on the flop when it's only beat a third of the time, and it's going to have outs a lot of the times when it is beat. So everything is very tricky here because I don't want to end up folding hands like ace queen, but by the same token, I don't want to just recklessly c-bet this flop and then just check fold after I check, because that doesn't seem ideal either, because we already saw with Equilab, we're not like that far ahead of the opponent's range, right? It was 50% each way, and even though the 3-betting range has the better distribution of equity, like the 3-betting range has 21% overbear, whereas the cutoff versus 3-bet flat range has only 14% overpair. So yeah, the 3-better does have a better distribution of equity as we expect to usually see, but the overall equity is 50-50, and being in position is a huge deal here. So boards like this, I think, really just showcase how hard poker is. Like, a lot of people think like, oh, if everyone plays solid, the games are just going to be impossible to beat, and they make it sound like playing solid's easy. Like, it's really hard to play well in a lot of spots. So right here, I decided to check call with aces and 9s to protect the check calling range. So I got my sets going, I got my aces with a heart going. Then I check called with I think I had 16 before, 16 ace queen combos, but again, that's probably mixed. And then like the 8s, and then some even pocket 7s and some flush draws that can bluff later. So very hard to develop a check calling range here, but you should sort of have a sense that in theory you have to be check calling here, and I don't even think it should be that rare because again, 50% equity each way, and we're out of position. The check raising range, I did try to check raise reasonably aggressively. I check raised 11 combos because I do know it's hard to check a call on this board. So I check raised aces without the hearts, pocket 8s, 1 flush draw, and then just some backdoor club draw stuff. And then that resulted in us betting the flop about 56% of the time and defending about 63% of our checks. So if we did check and our opponent bet half pot, his immediate expected value would be very low. So what I would really challenge you to do as you're looking at all these combos is if something seems bad or you don't like where I have a hand placed, I would challenge you to like generate a board like this and try to write out your entire range, and I think you'll see it's very, very hard to feel really good about how to play your whole range here. And there's a lot of hands that are really awkward, and honestly, I think most people want to do what I did in the last board texture. What was it? The 9-7-5, which is just always pretty much check fold once they check. But on the 9-8-4, I don't think it's as bad for our range. And I think it becomes more important to start to develop some sort of check calling range. So, it's hard to know where to draw the line, but in the last board, I just said, screw it, I'm not going to have a check calling range. Whereas on the 9-8-4 board, I did try to develop the check calling range. And even though the 9-8-4 board is easier, it's still very difficult to do. So if you wanted to try to write out all the combos, I think you'd see how hard it is to develop a check calling range here. But I think you also would have a sense of, yeah, but just because check calling is hard doesn't mean we should always be betting or always check folding, because clearly that has to be wrong here, right? When we see we only really have 50% equity out of position, I don't think we can bet 100% of our range here. And if we're always check folding once we check, that can't be right. So that wraps up our video. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I hope you learned a bunch of stuff. I know I said a whole lot this video, and I was probably a little bit difficult to follow at points, so I apologize to that, but it was quite a difficult video to make because this range was a lot harder to play than I was expecting. I thought since we're 3-betting a pretty much linear range, we should have like, a clear check calling range and stuff wouldn't be that difficult. But in reality, it's just a lot harder to play than I think the polarized range, because we can see in some spots we want to develop check calling ranges, like I think 984 is an example of that, but it's very difficult to tell how to design that range, and it probably uses a lot of mixed strategies. So don't do anything that you think will cost you money. Like, I think it's totally good to take the simple strategy that's easier to implement, even if it's not ideal. So feel free to do that on, the 975 board like I recommended, or even the 984 board, but just be aware of how ranges might look if you really start trying to balance your checking range, which you'll probably have to do when your range isn't that much stronger than your opponent's. I hope you learned a good amount on like the boards with the high cards, like the Ace 10-9 and the King Jack 8. I know for me, it really showcased that my usual like heads up rule, where I like to often bet middle pairs with the good kickers, doesn't seem like it's working very well when there's two reasonably high cards in 3-bet pots, because we don't really make our opponent fold high equity hands. So now on the Ace 10-9 board, I wouldn't bet jacks. I would actually bet a hand like, Ace Jack or Ace 5 before I bet jacks. So I learned that, and hopefully you agree with me, and if not, you can explain why in the forums. Same deal with the King Jack 8 board. I was probably betting Ace Jack before, and now I'll probably start checking with that because I'd rather just bet the weaker kings, because Ace Jack just doesn't really make any high equity hands fold, and I think not having some Jack X hands in our range on the turn when we do happen to turn a Jack isn't that big a deal. So yeah, if I bet the flop and my opponent calls and the turn's a Jack, I'm in bad shape on the King Jack 8 board, but I don't think it's that big a deal. So now I would just emphasize betting like the King 9 or anything like that. So yeah, hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed watching it, although it was probably a more difficult one than I intended. Good luck, everyone, and take care. Thanks. Bye.